On a cold April morning in 2007, a quiet college campus awoke to the sound of gunfire, and within minutes, 32 lives were gone. This is not just the story of a massacre. It is the story of warning signs missed, courage revealed, and a silence that cost everything. On that bitter April morning in 2007, the campus of Virginia Tech stirred awake like any other Monday. Students shuffled across the drill field with backpacks heavy with books, their breath visible in the unseasonable chill. Some clutched coffee, others tugged jackets tight against the wind, unaware that their lives, or the lives of their classmates, were about to be torn apart in a way that would mark history. It began quietly, almost unremarkably, in a dormitory known as West Ambler Johnston. Inside its walls, a troubled student named Seung-Hui Cho moved with a calmness that belied what he was about to do. He had lived in the shadows for years, silent in classrooms, withdrawn in dorm hallways, invisible to most who passed him by. But now, with 2 handguns concealed and his mind set, he stepped into a new role. Within minutes, 2 students, Ryan Clark, a gifted young man known for his warmth and intelligence, and Emily Hilscher, a freshman with a gentle spirit and a love for animals, lay dead. 9 minutes later, police were inside, but Cho was already gone, slipping back to his own dorm room, changing clothes, preparing for something larger, darker, far more devastating. The hours that followed would reveal the fragility of systems we trust to protect us, the hesitation of administrators, the blind spots of mental health services, and the catastrophic gap between warning signs and action. But in those early minutes, no one knew what was coming. Students kept heading to class. Professors unrolled their notes. Life on campus ticked forward toward catastrophe. As he prepared for his second act, Cho left behind not only bodies but words. From a downtown post office, he mailed a package, a manifesto of sorts, to NBC News, filled with rambling justifications, photographs, and videos in which he cast himself as both victim and avenger. He also sent a letter to his own English department, a haunting reminder of the strained relationship between his inner world and the academic community that had once tried to help him. Back on campus, students filtered into Norris Hall, unaware that doors were already being chained shut. A second-floor classroom full of engineering students settled into their seats, some yawning, some scribbling notes, others chatting in fragments of German or French. They didn't know that the man walking toward their building had rehearsed this moment, stockpiling ammunition, nurturing resentments, scripting his own horrific finale. At 9:40 a.m., gunfire cracked through the air, loud, sharp, relentless. The sound carried across the drill field, first mistaken for construction, then recognized for what it was. The echo of lives being stolen in rapid succession. Inside Norris Hall, panic spread like fire. Some students dove under desks, others tried to barricade doors with their bodies. Professor Liviu Librescu, a Holocaust survivor, pressed himself against a classroom door, holding it shut with all his strength, buying his students enough time to leap from windows. He would not survive, but his courage meant that dozens of others did. For 11 harrowing minutes, chaos reigned. Cho fired round after round, returning to rooms he had already attacked, ensuring no one was spared if they remained. When it ended, 32 lives had been extinguished. 26 more were wounded, and Cho himself lay dead from a self-inflicted shot, silent once more. That morning, as the winds rattled against the limestone buildings of Virginia Tech, phones buzzed with the most mundane concerns. A student texted a friend about borrowing notes. Another worried about a quiz. Professors hurried through lesson plans, unaware that their classrooms were about to be turned into battlegrounds. Across campus, no loudspeakers warned of the danger. No sirens cut through the cold. For most, the world was still intact. Students were jogging along sidewalks, laughing about weekend parties, gossiping about spring break romances. The violence at West Ambler Johnston Hall was spoken of, in whispers, as a possible domestic dispute, the kind of tragic but isolated event that universities sometimes absorb without wider disruption. But Seung-Hui Cho was already moving through a carefully rehearsed script. In his dorm room, he changed clothes, The act was deliberate, a symbolic shedding of one skin for another. He armed himself with a Glock 19 and a Walther P22, checked his ammunition, and left a digital trail. Writings, recordings, fragments of his mind captured in images and words. To him, this was not a spur-of-the-moment frenzy. It was a performance long in the making. At the Blacksburg post office, clerks processed mail as usual, unaware that one padded envelope contained a chilling manifesto. Inside were photographs of Cho holding his weapons, his face hardened into a mask of defiance. There were rambling letters, stitched together with grievances and delusions, in which he cast himself as a soldier against the world, a victim turned executioner. NBC would not receive the package until after the massacre, but by then the world would know his name. Back on campus, time ticked forward. At Norris Hall, classes settled into rhythm. In a French class, students stumbled through verb conjugations. Down the hall, in German, voices repeated phrases in hesitant accents. In advanced hydrology, diagrams of water systems filled chalkboards. In solid mechanics, Professor Liviu Librescu, 76 years old and a survivor of the Holocaust, paced at the front of his class, a gentle figure whose very life story was a lesson in resilience. None of them could have imagined what was coming. At 9:40 a.m., Cho pushed through the chain doors and began his second assault. The first shots rang out, confusing at first, then unmistakable. The sound of gunfire, loud, sharp, metallic, ricocheted off the walls. Students screamed, desks overturned, books scattered. In some rooms, panic froze students in place. In others, instinct drove them toward escape, through windows, down stairwells, into closets. Professor Librescu braced his body against a door, holding it shut while his students hurled themselves out of second-story windows. He knew the cost. He knew what it meant to buy time with his own life. His final act was not one of surrender but of defiance. A man who had survived the horrors of Nazi camps now meeting violence with the only shield he had, his body. In another classroom, students barricaded the door with tables and chairs, whispering prayers as Cho rattled the handle, fired into the wood, then moved on. Survival hinged on seconds, on the stubbornness of a doorframe, on the courage to act when terror told them to freeze. For 11 minutes, the building became a slaughterhouse.
Cho file 174 rounds.
He returned to rooms he had already attacked, determined to leave no survivor if he could help it. His silence was as chilling as the gunfire. Witnesses would later say he uttered not a word, not a scream, not a declaration, only the mechanical rhythm of trigger and reload. When police finally breached Norris Hall, Cho turned one of his guns on himself. The final shot ended his life, but not the terror he had unleashed. The echoes of his rampage would ripple outward, through families, through classrooms, through an entire nation grappling with the unthinkable. By the end, 32 innocent lives were gone. 26 more were wounded, and countless others, the witnesses, the first responders, the parents, the professors, the friends, would carry scars invisible but permanent. Outside Norris Hall, the sound of gunfire drew students into doorways, into bushes, into hiding. Some froze, staring across the drill field, unable to process what they were hearing. Others fled, clutching cell phones, their voices breaking as they dialed friends, roommates, parents. "Something's happening in Norris," one voice shouted into a phone. "Shots. I don't know how many. Oh my God. People are jumping from windows." Those who had escaped through shattered panes ran across the grass, blood on their clothes, glass in their skin, their eyes wide with shock. Some limped, some were carried. Others collapsed in silence, their legs buckling under the weight of survival. The first police officers pushed into Norris Hall just minutes after the 911 call, weapons drawn, boots echoing in stairwells. The doors had been chained, but they forced their way in, stepping into a scene that would never leave their memories. The air smelled of gunpowder. The halls were eerily quiet except for moans, cries, and the distant echo of footsteps that stopped as abruptly as they began. Cho was already dead when they found him. A single bullet through his head, a gun still at his side. Around him lay a trail of devastation that no officer, No medic, no administrator would ever forget. News spread at the speed of rumor, then at the speed of panic. Text messages multiplied across campus. Shooter, stay inside. Don't come out. The official email alert from the university, delayed, cautious, vague, landed too late to prevent what had already unfolded. On Interstate 81, parents pressed harder on their accelerators. Cars with Virginia Tech bumper stickers and window decals sped south, drivers gripping steering wheels until their knuckles turned white. Cell phones rang endlessly in passenger seats. Some were answered. Too many were not. In homes across Virginia, mothers and fathers watched cable news as the first reports broke. Shooting at Virginia Tech. Multiple injuries reported. The anchors speculated. Was it a domestic dispute? A prank? A single angry student? The scale of what had just happened had not yet been acknowledged. Then, at a press conference, the university's police chief confirmed the unimaginable. More than 20 dead. Reporters gasped audibly, their disbelief echoing what millions felt watching live. More than 20? The number seemed impossible, grotesque, obscene. By the end of the day, the final toll was 32, plus the shooter. A figure that would etch itself into history as the deadliest school shooting in American history. On campus, silence fell in waves. Students huddled in dorms, in libraries, in classrooms turned makeshift shelters. They whispered prayers. They scrolled their phones, desperate for names, desperate for certainty. And then came the endless ringing of unanswered phones. Parents who had called again and again with no reply began to understand what no parent ever wants to understand. By nightfall, vigils had sprung up spontaneously across Blacksburg. Candles flickered in the cold wind, flames bent sideways, students clutching each other for warmth and for courage. Songs were sung in voices that cracked under grief. Names began to surface. Faces appeared on television screens. Each story shattered hearts a little further. For those who had escaped Norris Hall, the world felt both too bright and too dark. They replayed seconds in their heads, asking why they had lived when the person next to them had not. Survivors' guilt began its cruel work immediately. And for the police officers, the medics, the professors who had stood outside Norris Hall hearing gunfire while knowing their students were inside, the weight was unbearable. No one walked away untouched. Blacksburg was a small town. Virginia Tech was not just a university. It was the lifeblood of the community. On that April day, everyone lost someone. A neighbor, a student, a friend, a colleague. The world now knew the name of Seung-Hui Cho. But for those who lived through it, what mattered were the names of the 32. The bright, ambitious, irreplaceable lives extinguished in a storm of bullets. That night, as the candles burned low and the winds carried the scent of smoke and sorrow across the drill field, the question that would haunt a nation began to form. How had this been allowed to happen? Long before the name Seung-Hui Cho became synonymous with tragedy, he was just a child, born in the bustling city of Seoul, South Korea, on January 18, 1984. His early years gave little hint of what was to come. His family was ordinary, hardworking, and deeply rooted in a culture that prized education and discipline. Like so many parents, his mother and father dreamed of more than what their circumstances offered. They wanted opportunities for their children that stretched beyond the crowded streets and narrow prospects of South Korea in the 1980s. When Seung-Hui was 8 years old, the family uprooted their lives and boarded a plane to the United States. They settled in Centerville, Virginia, a suburban community in Fairfax County. For his parents, the move was meant to be a gift, a chance at the American dream, a chance for their children to flourish in ways that seemed out of reach back home. But for Seung-Hui, the transition was not simple. The language was foreign. The culture was bewildering. The classrooms into which he was placed brimmed with loud, confident children who spoke English with ease. He spoke almost not at all. In elementary school, teachers noticed quickly that something was different. He did not raise his hand. He did not chatter with classmates. His words, when they came, were so soft they were barely audible. Eventually, a diagnosis came. Selective mutism, an anxiety disorder that makes speaking in certain social situations nearly impossible. At home, with his sister and parents, he could speak more freely. In public, silence wrapped around him like armor. Silence became his trademark. Teachers grew concerned. Some classmates teased him. His withdrawn presence made him an easy target for whispers and jokes. Mute, they called him. Weird. The cruelty of children left scars no one could see. By middle school, Seung-Hui was not just quiet, he was isolated. He drifted through hallways with his head down, a shadow among peers. Counselors suggested interventions. Special education programs were considered. But nothing truly reached him. His mutism was not defiance. It was fear, a paralysis of words. And yet, that fear curdled into something else. Resentment, then anger, then the dark beginnings of alienation. His sister, bright and outgoing, seemed to excel where he faltered. Teachers adored her. Friends flocked to her. For Seung-Hui, comparisons were inevitable. He receded further into himself, convinced he did not belong, convinced the world saw him as defective. The family, loving but struggling financially, poured themselves into survival. They ran a dry-cleaning business, working long hours, rarely home. They loved their son, but much of his struggle remained hidden behind his silence. He was not violent, not outwardly threatening. He was simply absent. In a society that prizes voice and confidence, absence can be its own kind of wound. High school brought little relief. Teachers recalled him as a boy who rarely spoke, who sometimes refused eye contact altogether. He was invisible, and yet his writings, when coaxed onto paper, hinted at storms beneath the still surface. Dark themes emerged: violence, vengeance, desperation. Most chalked it up to adolescent imagination. After all, countless teenagers scribble angry stories or sketch violent images. But for Seung-Hui, it was not a phase. It was a pattern. Counselors intervened again. He was flagged as troubled. Mental health professionals noted depression, anxiety, and his persistent mutism. At one point, a doctor even recommended treatment for what seemed to be major depression. There were suggestions of medication, suggestions of therapy, yet nothing truly stuck. Cho himself resisted, withdrawing further when pressed. And so he carried his silence forward, step by step, into adulthood. By the time he graduated from Westfield High School in 2003, he was still nearly a stranger to those around him. Teachers could barely recall the sound of his voice. His classmates would later say they hardly remembered him at all. A ghost had walked their hallways, a boy invisible until the day the world would never forget him. When he applied to Virginia Tech, his silence was not disqualifying. On paper, he was just another applicant. A student from Virginia with decent grades, a record clear of criminal behavior, a young man who seemed ready to study, to live, to learn. He was admitted. His major, Business Information Technology. Later, he would switch to English. For his parents, it was a triumph. Their quiet son would be the first in the family to attend a major American university. It was proof, they thought, that the sacrifice of leaving Korea had been worth it. For Seung-Hui himself, it was the beginning of both possibility and doom. On the sprawling, beautiful campus of Virginia Tech, surrounded by tens of thousands of students, he remained what he had always been: silent, withdrawn, almost invisible. But beneath that silence, something darker was growing. An anger fed by years of isolation, rejection, and untreated illness. It was here, at Virginia Tech, that his path would cross with professors who recognized the warning signs, with classmates who whispered uneasily about his strange presence, and with counselors who tried, and failed, to reach him. And it was here, too, that the first unmistakable red flags began to wave. When Seung-Hui Cho arrived at Virginia Tech in 2003, the campus seemed a world of opportunity. Rolling hills, limestone buildings glowing in the Appalachian sun, tens of thousands of students buzzing with energy and youth. For most, college was a time to find identity, to belong. For Cho, it became the backdrop for his deepening descent into solitude. He lived in Harper Hall, one of the campus dormitories. Roommates noticed immediately that he was unlike anyone else. He spoke rarely, if at all. He avoided eye contact. At times, He sat motionless for hours, staring at his desk or into empty space, as if trapped behind an invisible barrier. When asked simple questions, his answers were monosyllables, often whispered so quietly they were nearly inaudible. At first, some thought it was cultural shyness. Others assumed he was simply introverted. But soon, unease replaced sympathy. His silence was not passive. It felt heavy, unsettling. Some students reported that he would stand in doorways, watching without speaking, his expression unreadable. In hallways, he drifted like a ghost, present but unreachable. Professors noticed too. In his business classes, Cho struggled. His writing was awkward, his grades uneven. Eventually, he shifted majors to English, perhaps believing that words on paper might succeed where speech had failed. But the words he produced were not gentle explorations of literature. They were violent, disturbing, filled with anger that startled even seasoned instructors. In one creative writing class, his plays were so dark, so graphic, that classmates recoiled. One described them as the kind of thing you'd expect from a horror film. Characters screamed of vengeance, of hatred, of murder. Guns and knives appeared again and again. Women, in particular, were often depicted as victims. Nikki Giovanni, a celebrated poet and professor, encountered him in her classroom in 2005. She had seen all kinds of students, all kinds of voices, but Cho unnerved her. He wore sunglasses indoors, kept a cap pulled low, filmed students with his cell phone without permission. His writings were not simply edgy, they felt like threats. The atmosphere in the classroom shifted whenever he walked in. Giovanni made a decision. She told the department chair she would resign rather than continue teaching him. That was how deeply his presence disturbed her. It was not a casual judgment. It was survival instinct. Enter Lucinda Roy, another professor in the English department, who agreed to work with Cho one-on-one instead of keeping him in a class that had become unsafe. She, too, quickly realized that something was wrong. His voice was so soft it was nearly imperceptible. His pauses so long they seemed to stretch into voids. His writings hinted at fury and despair. She urged him to seek counseling, even walked him toward resources. For a brief moment, he appeared willing. He even reached out to the campus counseling center. But nothing lasting came of it. Behind the scenes, emails circulated between faculty and administration. "This student is troubled," they warned. "We are concerned for safety." But the machinery of university policy was slow, bound by privacy laws, wary of liability. Without a direct, explicit threat, intervention was limited. And Cho knew how to skirt that line. He never said, "I will hurt you." He only wrote worlds soaked in blood and pain, cloaked just enough as fiction to escape decisive action. Roommates grew increasingly unsettled. Some requested to be moved. They described him as creepy, strange, like he wasn't really there. One recalled that Cho would sometimes mutter under his breath, not quite audible, as if speaking to someone only he could hear. Others remembered the way he took secret photos of women on campus, tracking them with a lens but never with words. By 2005, red flags were everywhere. Professors alarmed, classmates frightened, counselors contacted, police even aware, tangentially. And yet, each system encountered the same barrier: silence. He had not broken laws. He had not made direct threats. He was, in the language of policy, a student with issues, but not yet an imminent danger. The irony was cruel. His condition, selective mutism, shielded him from intervention. By saying almost nothing, by speaking only in whispers and scribbles, he made it nearly impossible for authorities to cross the line into decisive action. His silence became his camouflage. Still, those who worked closest with him felt the unease grow heavier. Lucinda Roy later recalled that meeting with Cho alone made her nervous enough to insist that an assistant sit just outside her door. His presence radiated something difficult to name. Not overt menace, but an unsettling void, a sense that something vital in him had shut down. In dorm rooms, in classrooms, in counseling offices, the same thought flickered again and again. Something is wrong here. And yet, Cho moved forward, semester after semester, a ghost with grades, quietly accumulating credits toward graduation. Every system saw pieces of him. None saw the whole. And that gap between what was noticed and what was done would prove catastrophic. By the fall of 2005, the whispers about Seung-Hui Cho had grown too loud to ignore. Within the English department, his name circulated not just as a struggling student, but as a source of fear. His writings had crossed into violent fantasy. His presence in class unsettled peers to the point that they asked for protection. Professors, seasoned in handling eccentricity, admitted openly, "This feels different." Yet the university's response remained cautious, tangled in procedure. Privacy laws dictated what could and could not be shared. Intervention required explicit threats, and Cho, master of silence, never gave them that. Still, his behavior outside classrooms was no less troubling. Women across campus reported encounters that left them shaken. In November 2005, a student told police that Cho had been stalking her. He had shown up at her dorm, left messages, pursued her despite her lack of interest. When confronted, he brushed it off, claiming misunderstanding. Days later, another woman filed a similar complaint. 2 separate reports within weeks. Campus police questioned him. He admitted to little. He had not made physical contact, had not issued threats. Once again, the behavior was concerning. But not criminal, not enough to suspend, not enough to expel. He walked away with a warning. But the pattern was undeniable. Isolation, obsession, rejection, escalation. Professors like Lucinda Roy pressed harder. She urged Cho to seek real help, not just lip service. For a while, he reached out, contacting the Cook Counseling Center, the on-campus mental health provider. Counselors took his calls, scheduled sessions. But here, too, the cracks of the system widened. His file was handled by multiple clinicians, never with continuity. Notes were written, but follow-up was inconsistent. And when Cho resisted or skipped appointments, the system simply let the trail go cold. At one point, after his stalking incidents, a judge even ruled that Cho should undergo outpatient treatment. It was a pivotal moment, the rare legal foothold to intervene. But the mandate was never fully enforced. Outpatient treatment depended on Cho's compliance. And Cho, already resistant, never followed through in any meaningful way. The court order dissolved into paperwork. Meanwhile, his behavior on campus continued to send shivers. Roommates described him as increasingly withdrawn. He spent hours typing alone, curtains drawn. Sometimes he muttered under his breath, speaking to no one. Other times, he disappeared for long stretches without explanation. When questioned, his responses were evasive or silent. Faculty meetings in the English department turned tense whenever his name arose. Nikki Giovanni refused to allow him back in her class. Roy remained on edge in her one-on-one sessions. The consensus was clear. This student is not simply odd, he is dangerous. Yet the machinery to address it stalled again and again. Some administrators worried about violating his rights. Others feared legal exposure if they acted too aggressively. In the end, bureaucracy triumphed over urgency. Warnings piled up, but decisive action never came. The tragedy of hindsight is cruel. So many moments now seem like turning points, opportunities to alter his trajectory. The stalking complaints, the counseling failures, the court order. Each was a chance to intervene more forcefully. Each in its own way was lost. As 2006 began, Cho remained enrolled. His writings grew darker. His silence grew heavier. His obsessions deepened. The storm inside him gathered strength, unnoticed in full by anyone, until it was far too late. By the fall of 2006, Seung-Hui Cho was still, against all odds, a student in good standing at Virginia Tech. On paper, he was progressing toward his degree in English. In reality, he was retreating further into darkness. His professors in the English department had long since stopped seeing him as simply shy or troubled. His writings grew more violent, more chaotic, as if he were purging his mind of demons onto the page. Classmates who read his plays and short stories were unsettled. Some whispered about dropping the class. One student later admitted, I thought if anyone on this campus was going to do something violent, it would be him. The content of his work was soaked in revenge fantasies. Characters shouted profanities at authority figures, brutalized women, and spoke in apocalyptic tones. Guns and knives appeared with regularity. What frightened those around him wasn't just the violence itself. It was the conviction behind it. His words didn't read like imagination. They read like confession. Yet once again, the university system treaded lightly. Faculty raised alarms. Notes were exchanged. Counseling was suggested. But Cho slipped through the gaps, protected by privacy laws, silence, and a reluctance to brand a student as dangerous without undeniable proof. Meanwhile, his life outside the classroom followed the same lonely, eerie pattern. Roommates described him as existing on the margins. He rarely spoke. He rarely left. Sometimes, late at night, they heard him moving, typing, whispering to himself. He took photographs of women in secret, obsessed from afar but never capable of normal human connection. Isolation became his only constant companion. He avoided clubs, avoided social events, avoided dining halls when they were crowded. On the rare occasions he ventured out, he moved quickly, head down, as if the very act of being among others was unbearable. But beneath that invisibility, Cho was preparing. Slowly, methodically, he began to stockpile. In February 2007, he purchased a Glock 19 handgun from a pawn shop in nearby Roanoke. He passed the background check with ease. Days later, he bought a Walther P22 pistol. Along with them, he accumulated ammunition, hundreds of rounds purchased legally, quietly, with no one to question his intentions. At the same time, he started compiling a manifesto of sorts. Photographs of himself wielding weapons. Videos in which he spoke for once, but not to anyone present. Into the lens of a camera, he raged against the world, against imagined enemies, against classmates he believed had mocked him. His words were broken, disjointed, but his anger was unmistakable. The recordings revealed a man consumed by grievance, seeing himself as a martyr for the downtrodden. A soldier fighting a war no one else acknowledged. He invoked Columbine. He invoked Jesus. He painted himself as both victim and avenger. Back on campus, the weather shifted from winter to spring. Students looked forward to the semester's end, to graduation, to summer freedom. No one imagined that one of their peers was plotting an act that would make their school's name synonymous with tragedy. To those around him, Cho remained the same. Quiet, eerie, unsettling. He continued to haunt classrooms, continued to write of violence. Professors continued to send warnings upward. The warnings, once again, dissolved into bureaucracy. In early April, just days before the massacre, Cho spent time in a gun range, practicing with the Glock and the Walther. Witnesses remembered him standing stiffly, firing mechanically, expressionless. He drew little attention. After all, in Virginia, gun ranges were filled with students, locals, hobbyists. Nothing about him seemed remarkable except perhaps his silence. Back in his dorm room, he laid out chains to lock doors, receipts for ammunition, notes scribbled with anger. He prepared packages, addressed one to NBC News, to be mailed on the morning of his rampage. The storm was nearly ready to break. And yet, all across campus, life carried on as normal. Students studied for exams. Professors graded papers. Parents made plans for graduation. Even those who had once raised alarms about Cho had, by now, grown used to the idea that he was strange but manageable. On the surface, Virginia Tech was calm, even idyllic. But underneath, the countdown had begun. The day began like so many others on Virginia Tech's sprawling campus. It was cold, unseasonably so, the kind of sharp Appalachian morning that makes students pull their jackets tighter as they hurry to class. The sky hung heavy with gray clouds, and a bitter wind tore across the drill field, carrying with it no hint of what was about to unfold. At 7:15 a.m., while most students were still shaking off sleep, Seung-Hui Cho was already on the move. He left his dorm in Harper Hall, walked across campus with a handgun concealed under his clothes, and entered West Ambler Johnston Hall, one of the largest residence halls at Virginia Tech. Inside lived Emily Hilscher, a freshman studying animal and poultry sciences, known among friends for her bright spirit and love of horses. That morning, she had returned to her room after spending the weekend with her boyfriend. Just a few doors down lived Ryan Clark, a senior resident assistant, a young man beloved by everyone who knew him, described as brilliant, kind, and endlessly generous. The details of what happened in Emily's room remained chillingly sparse. Neighbors heard voices, then gunfire, sharp, startling cracks that shattered the early morning silence. When police arrived minutes later, they found Emily gravely wounded, Ryan shot dead. Emily would cling to life for a short while, but her injuries proved fatal. It was 7:24 a.m. when officers reached the scene. Cho, however, had already vanished. He slipped out of the dorm unnoticed, returning briefly to his own room in Harper Hall to change his blood-stained clothes. The university community, still waking up, knew little of what had just occurred. Rumors spread quickly in West Ambler Johnston. Some said it was a domestic dispute. Others speculated about a jealous boyfriend. Early police reports suggested a murder-suicide. The working theory was intimate, contained, tragic, yes, but not a broader threat. At 8:25 a.m., university officials met with campus police to assess the situation. They debated whether to alert the entire campus. The police insisted they had leads. A person of interest, Emily's boyfriend, who was off campus at the time. It looked to them like a crime of passion, already over. So the decision was made. No immediate campus-wide alert. Students poured into classrooms, professors into lecture halls. Thousands crossed the drill field in the biting wind. Life in all its fragile routine carried on. Meanwhile, Cho was preparing for something much larger. At 9:01 a.m., he entered the downtown Blacksburg post office and mailed a package to NBC News. Inside were his writings, photographs of himself posing with weapons, and a video manifesto in which he railed against classmates, professors, and society at large. He compared himself to Jesus Christ, painted himself as a martyr, and vowed vengeance. By 9:15 a.m., Cho was back on campus, walking toward Norris Hall, an academic building at the edge of the drill field. In his backpack, he carried chains and locks. Methodically, he chained shut 3 of the main entrances, ensuring that once the attack began, escape would be nearly impossible. And still, no campus-wide alarm had sounded. Finally, at 9:26 a.m., an email went out from the administration to faculty, staff, and students. There had been a shooting at a residence hall earlier that morning. Please be cautious, it warned. But by then, it was far too late. Inside Norris Hall, students were settling into their second classes of the day. Intermediate French, elementary German, advanced hydrology, solid mechanics, scientific computing. To them, the morning email was distant, an incident across campus, tragic but contained. Their minds were on quizzes, lectures, and the ordinary anxieties of student life. At 9:40 a.m., the gunfire began. Cho moved from classroom to classroom, firing with cold precision. He carried nearly 400 rounds of ammunition. His demeanor was described later as emotionless, silent. He said nothing as he shot, nothing as he reloaded, nothing as terrified students begged for their lives. In French and German classes, students fell before they could react. In solid mechanics, Professor Liviu Librescu, a Holocaust survivor, held the classroom door shut with his body, yelling at students to jump from the second-story windows. They obeyed. Many escaped. He did not. In scientific computing, students barricaded the door with desks, chairs, and sheer determination. Cho fired into the wood, but the barricade held. Inside, students trembled in silence, listening as the gunman moved on. For 11 minutes, the building was a war zone. In that time, Cho fired 174 rounds, returning to classrooms he had already attacked, ensuring survivors were not left behind. By 9:51 a.m., police breached Norris Hall, racing up stairwells, weapons drawn. But the killing was already over. Cho had turned one of his guns on himself. A single shot ended his life, leaving behind only silence and devastation. In less than 3 hours, Virginia Tech had been transformed forever. 32 innocent lives were gone. 26 others wounded. Dozens more scarred by what they had seen, what they had heard, what they would never be able to forget. The deadliest school shooting in American history had just unfolded. Not in a war zone, not in a city rife with crime, but on a quiet campus in the Blue Ridge Mountains, on a morning that had begun like any other. And for parents racing down Interstate 81, their phones buzzing unanswered in the passenger seat, the nightmare was only just beginning. When the gunfire ended and the echoes faded, silence fell over Norris Hall. But that silence was not peace. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that follows catastrophe. In the hours that followed, names began to emerge. At first, there were only numbers 20, then 30, then 32. But each number carried a name, and each name carried a story. Among the first to be mourned was Ryan Clark, the 22-year-old resident advisor who had rushed to help when Emily Hilscher screamed in her dorm room. Ryan, known to friends as Stack, was brilliant, a triple major in biology, English, and psychology. He was the kind of student professors loved to teach, the kind of friend others leaned on. A scholarship student, a marching band member, a young man with a laugh that carried. He had planned to pursue a PhD in psychology. Instead, his life ended in an instant trying to help someone else. Emily Hilscher, just 19, had barely begun her college journey. She loved animals, dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Friends remembered her as kind, bubbly, someone who lit up a room. She kept photographs of horses on her dorm walls. She had been on her way to an 8 a.m. chemistry class that morning. Her life was taken before the day had even properly begun. In Norris Hall, the loss was staggering. Liviu Librescu, the 76-year-old professor who had survived the Holocaust, was remembered as a scholar, an engineer, and above all, a teacher who cared deeply for his students. On that morning, he gave them his last lesson: courage. By bracing himself against the door and urging his class to escape, he saved nearly everyone in the room. His sacrifice became one of the most powerful symbols of that day. In the French class, Jocelyn Couture-Nowak, a French instructor from Canada, was known not only for her teaching but for her warmth and humor. She had fought tirelessly to bring French back to the local high schools, believing language was a bridge between cultures. Her students adored her. She died among them, a teacher until the end. The victims were students and professors, dreamers and doers, Americans and international visitors. They came from Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and far beyond: India, Indonesia, Peru, Egypt, Puerto Rico. Some were just weeks away from graduation. Some were freshmen who had only just begun to imagine the futures they might have. Pertahi Lumbantoruan, a graduate student from Indonesia, was passionate about civil engineering. Minal Panchal, from India, had just begun her master's degree in architecture. G.V. Loganathan, a beloved professor from India, had taught at Virginia Tech for more than 20 years. His death devastated generations of students who remembered him as both brilliant and kind. Rima Sameha, 18 years old, was remembered as radiant, full of life, with a love of dance and theater. Her family would later fight tirelessly for gun law reforms in her memory. Daniel Perez Cueva, a graduate student from Peru, studied international trade and loved soccer. Matthew Gwaltney, just 24, had a wide smile and a love for sports journalism. Mary Red, a freshman, had only begun to taste the independence of college life. The names continued: Nicole White, who loved art; Rachel Hill, who loved volunteering; Austin Cloyd, remembered for her passion for service; Henry Lee, Jarrett Lane, Leslie Sherman. Each name a world of dreams. Each life abruptly ended in Norris Hall. The sheer diversity of the victims struck many. They represented the global reach of Virginia Tech, a university that drew talent from every corner of the world. Their deaths resonated not only in the United States but across oceans, where families waited for phone calls that would never come. For parents, the confirmation came in the cruelest of ways. Hours of unanswered texts and frantic voicemails ended with a knock on the door or a phone call from an official voice on the other end. Some heard their child's name read aloud at a press conference. Others traveled to Blacksburg only to be led into rooms where grief counselors tried to find words that never could be enough. In the days that followed, makeshift memorials bloomed across campus. 32 stones were placed on the drill field, each one a marker of a life stolen. Students draped them in flowers, photographs, handwritten notes. At night, candles flickered, casting halos of light in the darkness. Thousands gathered in hushed silence, the only sounds the rustle of jackets in the cold wind and the occasional sob that broke through. What emerged from those gatherings was not just sorrow but testimony. These lives mattered. They were more than victims of a gunman's rage. They were scholars, dancers, musicians, athletes, engineers, teachers, dreamers. Their absence would ripple across decades. Families unmade, futures erased. And so, when the number 32 was repeated again and again in news reports, those who knew them insisted. They were not numbers. They were people. On the campus of Virginia Tech, where their laughter once filled classrooms, only silence remained. In the hours after the gunfire ceased, Virginia Tech's campus was frozen in shock. Police and medics rushed through Norris Hall, stepping over backpacks and bloodstains, checking pulses, carrying stretchers. Outside, students gathered in clusters, some weeping, some staring blankly, others furiously dialing numbers on their phones, desperate for someone to answer. Helicopters hovered overhead, cameras zooming in on frightened faces. Reporters flooded into Blacksburg from across Virginia, then from across the nation. Within hours, the campus was not just a crime scene, it was the epicenter of global attention. For students barricaded in dorms and classrooms, information was scarce and contradictory. Text messages flew back and forth. "Are you okay? They say it's 20 dead. No, it's 30. Don't go outside." The only official communication many received was the 9:26 a.m. email, a vague warning about a dorm shooting that had already been overtaken by events. By the time they read it, Cho was already inside Norris Hall. That delay, later known as the 2-hour gap, became the central question. Why hadn't the university sounded the alarm after the first murders in West Ambler Johnston Hall? At noon, Virginia Tech's president, Charles Stager, stepped before reporters. His face was pale, his words measured but strained. He confirmed what students had already whispered: more than 20 dead. When pressed, he defended the university's decision not to close campus after the first shootings. "We believed it was an isolated incident," he explained. "We had reason to think the perpetrator had fled." But for parents watching on television, those words were unbearable. They had raced down Interstate 81, hoping to find their children safe, only to hear the unthinkable number spoken aloud. For those who had lost sons and daughters, the explanation felt like betrayal. The warning had come too late. Journalists seized on the controversy immediately. Was it negligence? Was it fear of panic? Or was it the university protecting its image? Questions ricocheted through the press briefings, each sharper than the last. Meanwhile, students tried to process the incomprehensible. They gathered on the drill field, hugging, crying, staring at Norris Hall with haunted eyes. Some carried signs that simply read, "Why?" Others left flowers and notes on the steps of Burris Hall, the administrative building that now felt like the heart of a shaken community. The world, too, was stunned. News networks ran nonstop coverage. Headlines blared, "Worst campus shooting in U.S. history." Images of Norris Hall, of weeping students, of police swarming the drill field, filled screens from New York to London to Seoul. In South Korea, where Cho had been born, the news triggered shock and shame. The South Korean president issued a formal apology on behalf of the nation, though Cho had lived in the United States for most of his life. By the end of that day, one thing was clear: Virginia Tech was no longer just a university. It was a symbol of grief, of failure, of the terrifying reality that classrooms could become killing grounds. The anger came next. Parents demanded answers. Politicians issued statements. Mental health experts, gun rights advocates, civil liberties lawyers, all began weighing in before the bodies of the victims had even been returned to their families. The debates began immediately, about guns, about mental health, about warning systems, about privacy laws. But in Blacksburg, for those still walking across a campus marked by blood, the debates felt distant. Their grief was raw, their questions more personal. Why had their friends died while they lived? Why had professors given their lives to save them? Why had their university failed to see what now seems so obvious? In the shadows of Norris Hall, flowers piled up. Candles flickered against the cold wind. The campus had been transformed overnight into a place of mourning. And in the middle of it all, administrators faced a question they could not escape. Why had silence lasted 2 hours while a killer prepared? The day after the massacre, Virginia Tech's campus no longer felt like a university. The drill field, usually alive with students crossing to class, had transformed into sacred ground. Flowers, handwritten notes, and 32 makeshift memorials marked the heart of campus. Candles flickered in the wind. A hush hung over the crowd of thousands who gathered there, their voices low, their movements slow, as if sound itself might break the fragile dignity of mourning. At 2 p.m. on April 17, 2007, the university held a memorial convocation inside Castle Coliseum. The arena, normally thunderous with basketball games, was filled instead with silence and tears. Thousands of students, faculty, and families sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces streaked with grief. At the front sat the parents of the dead, clutching tissues, photographs, each other's hands. Behind them were classmates who had escaped Norris Hall, their bodies still bruised from jumping out of windows, their minds haunted by the screams they had left behind. When University President Charles Steger approached the podium, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. He spoke of sorrow, of resilience, of the bonds of Hokie Nation. His words were sincere, but many still carried anger from the day before. The 2-hour gap weighed on every heart, even as the community came together to grieve. Governor Tim Kaine spoke next, acknowledging the profound loss and promising investigation. He urged the crowd to remember not the killer, but the lives of the 32 who had been stolen. Then came President George W. Bush. The weight of the presidency had carried him into countless moments of national tragedy, but here his tone softened. He spoke directly to the students, acknowledging the unbearable pain, praising the courage of professors like Liviu Librescu, urging resilience. "May God bless you and may God bless the souls who fell here," he said. Yet the moment that etched itself into history came not from politicians, but from a poet. Nikki Giovanni, the same professor who had once refused to keep Cho in her classroom, now stood before the grieving community. Her voice was steady, her words fierce. "We are Virginia Tech," she began. "We do not understand this tragedy. We know we did nothing to deserve it. But neither does a child in Africa dying of AIDS. Neither do the invisible children walking the night away to avoid being captured by a rogue army. We are strong and brave and innocent and unafraid." Her poems soared above the crowd, transforming sorrow into defiance. "We will prevail. We are Virginia Tech." By the time she finished, the arena erupted. Not in cheers, but in thunderous applause, a release of anguish, a declaration of survival. Those words would be remembered long after the speeches of presidents and governors faded. That night, as darkness fell over Blacksburg, the candlelight vigil began. Tens of thousands filled the drill field, shoulder to shoulder, each holding a flame. The candles lit the night like stars scattered across the earth. The sound of hymns rose in the air, mingling with sobs, with whispered prayers, with silence too sacred to name. From the steps of Norris Hall, the sight was overwhelming. A sea of flickering light, students holding one another, families standing with strangers. The community bound together in grief and love. Television cameras captured the moment, broadcasting it to the world. Viewers across the globe wept as they watched. It was here, in the glow of those candles, that the community began to find its footing. Grief did not vanish. Anger did not dissipate. But solidarity emerged, the sense that Virginia Tech was not alone, that the world grieved with them. And yet, even in that moment of unity, questions lingered. Why had Cho been allowed to remain on campus? Why had warnings gone unheeded? Why had the alert come so late? The candles burned with both sorrow and suspicion, their flames reflecting not only love for the dead, but the ache of unanswered questions. For now, though grief came first, the debates could wait, the investigations could follow. That night, with thousands of candles blazing against the cold, Virginia Tech stood together in defiance of despair. The world had seen tragedy. Now it saw resilience. On the morning of April 16th, between the murders at West Ambler Johnston Hall and the slaughter at Norris, Seung-Hui Cho slipped into the Blacksburg post office. Surveillance cameras captured him waiting in line like any other customer, his face blank, his movements calm. In his hands was a padded envelope, addressed to NBC News in New York. Inside lay the fragments of a mind consumed by grievance. Photographs of himself, glaring into the camera, sometimes holding his Glock in one hand and a hammer in the other. Videos, recorded in the cramped space of his dorm room, in which he finally spoke aloud, ranting at length. Pages of text, typed and printed, filled with furious, rambling justifications. For 2 days, the package traveled through the postal system. By the time it arrived at NBC's Rockefeller Plaza headquarters in Manhattan, Cho was already dead, the massacre already known to the world. At 11 a.m. on April 18th, NBC staff opened the envelope. What spilled out horrified them. A video diary of hate and delusion. Cho railed against rich kids, debauchery, and deceitful charlatans. He cast himself as a martyr, likening himself to Jesus Christ and the Columbine shooters. His tone shifted wildly, at times whispering, at times shouting in sudden rage. The photographs were just as chilling. Cho staring directly into the lens, jaw set, weapons displayed. They looked like publicity stills for a horror film, except they were real, and their author had already taken 32 lives. NBC executives faced an agonizing decision. The contents were news, undeniably so, but to broadcast them risked giving Cho exactly what he had wanted. A stage, an audience, immortality. In the end, they compromised. Portions of the videos were aired, photographs shown, but with careful editing and commentary. Still, the impact was seismic. That evening, television screens across America lit up with Cho's face. Viewers saw the hollow eyes, the fury, the weapons. They heard his voice, breaking for the first time into the public sphere. For many, it felt like violation, as though the killer was reaching into their living rooms, claiming attention he did not deserve. Families of the victims reacted with outrage. They had barely begun to mourn, barely held funerals, when the airwaves filled with the image of the man who had taken their children. To them, it was salt in an open wound. "Why are you giving him what he wanted?" they asked. "Why are you showing his face instead of theirs?" Media critics debated furiously. Was NBC complicit in spreading propaganda for a mass murderer? Or were they fulfilling a duty to inform the public of the truth, however ugly? The lines blurred. Other networks picked up the material, replaying clips, dissecting Cho's words. His ramblings became sound bites. His images became headlines. Law enforcement, too, was unsettled. The package confirmed what they already suspected. This was not a spontaneous act. It was calculated, rehearsed, staged for maximum impact. Cho had timed his mailing so that his words would surface after his death, ensuring that his voice would not be silenced by his own bullet. The FBI quickly analyzed the videos and writings. What emerged was not a manifesto in any coherent sense, but a collage of paranoia, delusion, and rage. His grievances were vast, unfocused, almost theatrical. He blamed society, wealth, women, professors, classmates. He positioned himself as the champion of the oppressed, though no one had asked for his crusade. Psychologists who studied the material later described it as the work of a deeply disturbed mind, filled with narcissism, persecution, and grandiosity. He was not fighting for a cause, they argued, but for attention, for validation of the hatred that had consumed him. For the families of the 32, however, analysis mattered little. All they saw was airtime given to the face of the man who had destroyed their world. Some begged networks to stop airing the videos. Some turned off their televisions altogether. but the damage was done. Cho had managed, even in death, to insert himself into the national conversation. His package had succeeded in what it set out to do, to haunt, to provoke, to make himself unforgettable. And yet, even as his face spread across screens, the counter-response grew louder. Remember the victims, not the killer. Students began circulating photographs of their lost friends. Families shared stories of laughter, talent, promise. Professors were remembered for their courage. The university insisted 32 lives mattered more than one name. The debate between truth and responsibility, between coverage and glorification, would continue long after. But in April 2007, the shock of seeing Cho's face, hearing his voice, was almost too much to bear. The massacre had left scars. His videos had reopened them. In the weeks after April 16th, grief gave way to anger, and anger demanded answers. 32 students and faculty had been killed in the heart of a university. Parents wanted to know how such a thing could happen in a country with so many resources, so many warning systems, so many opportunities to intervene. The governor of Virginia, Tim Kaine, responded by establishing the Virginia Tech Review Panel, a team of experts drawn from law enforcement, psychology, higher education, and security. Their mission was clear: to reconstruct every step of that day and every decision leading up to it in order to understand not just what happened, but why it hadn't been prevented. The panel began with the timeline. Their investigation revealed the chilling precision of Cho's actions. At 7:15 a.m., he killed Emily Hilscher and Ryan Clark in West Ambler Johnston Hall. At 9:01 a.m., he mailed his package to NBC. At 9:40 a.m., he began his assault on Norris Hall, chaining the doors and firing his first shots. By 9:51 a.m., it was over. The most damning revelation was the 2-hour gap between the first murders and the Norris Hall massacre. In that window, administrators debated what to do. Police believed the first incident was domestic, isolated, already contained. University leaders worried about sparking panic by issuing a lockdown. So, no alert was sent until 9:26 a.m., 14 minutes before Cho opened fire in Norris. For the families of the dead, that gap was unforgivable. Had the campus been locked down at 7:30, classrooms emptied, doors barred, lives might have been saved. But the panel didn't stop at April 16th. They dug deeper into Cho's past and uncovered a long trail of missed opportunities. At Virginia Tech, professors had raised alarms about his disturbing writings and unsettling presence. Nikki Giovanni had demanded his removal from her class. Lucinda Roy had begged administrators to intervene. Counseling staff had noted his depression and mutism. Police had confronted him over stalking incidents. And a judge in late 2005 had even declared him mentally ill, ordering outpatient treatment. And yet, nothing stuck. Privacy laws prevented faculty from sharing detailed concerns. Counseling staff failed to coordinate across offices. The court order was never properly enforced. Cho never followed through with treatment, and no one tracked whether he did. Each system saw fragments of him. None assembled the whole. The review panel's final report was unsparing. Concluded that Virginia Tech failed at multiple levels. Communication. The university's delayed warning cost lives. Mental health. Cho's severe illness was noted but never properly treated. Threat assessment. No coordinated system existed to evaluate high-risk students. Law enforcement. The initial assumption that the first shootings were isolated blinded police to the broader danger. It was a portrait not of a single catastrophic mistake, but of a cascade of smaller failures, each compounding the next. The report also touched on gun laws. Despite his mental health ruling, Cho had been able to legally purchase firearms. The information that should have flagged him in background checks never made it into the federal system. His Glock and Walther were obtained without resistance, ammunition bought in bulk without suspicion. The conclusions were painful. Cho had been visible, his struggles documented, his dangers hinted at, but the systems meant to protect students. Universities, counselors, courts, law enforcement were siloed, fragmented, and hesitant. The phrase that echoed through the final report was haunting in its simplicity. It could have been prevented. For families who buried their children, that phrase was unbearable. It meant that the deaths of 32 weren't simply tragic. They were avoidable. For the families of Virginia Tech's 32 victims, grief did not end with funerals. It lingered, heavy and relentless, in empty bedrooms, in unanswered cell phones still lying on nightstands, in the silence at dinner tables where laughter used to live. But alongside grief came determination. The parents, siblings, and loved ones of the dead refused to let the massacre be reduced to a headline. If their children had been taken because of failures in mental health care, in communication, in gun law enforcement, then those failures had to be confronted. One of the loudest voices was Colin Goddard, a survivor who had been shot multiple times in Norris Hall but lived. As soon as he recovered enough to walk, he began speaking publicly, traveling across the country, testifying before lawmakers. He carried X-rays of the bullets still lodged in his body, a living reminder of the cost of inaction. Parents joined him. They formed advocacy groups, some focused on mental health reform, others on gun laws, still others on improving campus security. They lobbied Congress, met with governors, pushed universities nationwide to adopt emergency alert systems that could warn students instantly by text. Before Virginia Tech, few campuses had mass notification systems. Afterward, almost every university in America installed one. Today, the familiar buzz of a campus-wide text alert, shelter in place, active shooter reported, traces its origin back to April 16, 2007. That was the legacy of parents who refused to stay silent. Another critical fight was over mental health reporting. The review panel had exposed the flaw that allowed Cho to purchase guns. Though a Virginia judge had deemed him mentally ill in 2005, that record had never reached the national database used for background checks. Families demanded change. In 2008, Congress passed the Nix Improvement Amendments Act, a direct response to Virginia Tech. It required states to submit more complete mental health records to the federal system. The bill carried the fingerprints of grieving parents who had walked the halls of Congress, photographs of their children pinned to their jackets. For them, advocacy was not politics. It was survival, the only way to give meaning to lives cut short. But advocacy did not erase pain. Behind every press conference was a family shattered. Parents spoke of waking each morning and forgetting, for a split second, that their child was gone, then remembering. Siblings spoke of graduations, weddings, milestones that would forever carry an empty chair. At memorial services, their voices cracked as they told stories of who their children had been. Rima dancing on stage, Austin serving his community, Emily riding horses. Each memory was a protest against erasure, a refusal to let the killer's name define the story. The families did not agree on everything. Some demanded stricter gun laws. Others, supportive of gun rights, focused instead on mental health. But all shared a common mission: to prevent another campus from suffering what Virginia Tech had endured. Their fight carried them far beyond Blacksburg. They stood in state houses. They sat before congressional committees. They spoke at conferences on education and safety. Wherever their voices could reach, they carried the names of their loved ones. And yet, even as reforms were passed, each victory carried bitterness. No law could bring back a child. No policy could replace the sound of laughter silenced on April 16th. For these families, the fight for change was both tribute and torment. Tribute because it honored the dead. Torment because every time they told their story, they had to relive the moment they lost everything. In this way, grief became activism, a relentless pursuit of meaning in the face of senselessness. The parents of Virginia Tech did what parents should never have to do. They turned their children's absence into fuel for reform so that maybe, just maybe, another family would be spared. In the weeks after Virginia Tech, the country did what it always does after tragedy. It argued. The massacre was the deadliest school shooting in U.S. history. 32 lives lost, 26 wounded, and a killer who had passed background checks, bought his weapons legally, and moved undetected through a university system that had raised alarms but never acted. To many, it was proof of systemic failure. To others, it was a warning about rushing into reform. The most immediate flashpoint was gun control. Advocates called Virginia Tech a wake-up call. How, they asked, could a man declared mentally ill by a judge be allowed to buy 2 handguns without obstruction? How could he stockpile hundreds of rounds without notice? Gun rights supporters pushed back. They argued that stricter gun laws would not have stopped Cho. The real failure, they said, was in mental health reporting and enforcement. The laws we have weren't followed, they insisted. We don't need new ones. We need to fix the system. The debate sharpened when some pointed out that Virginia Tech was a gun-free campus. Students and faculty had been prohibited from carrying weapons. To gun rights advocates, this was proof that disarming good people only left them vulnerable. If even one professor had been armed, one commentator argued, maybe this wouldn't have happened. On the other side, survivors and families recoiled at that suggestion. More guns, they argued, would have turned Norris Hall into even greater chaos. Crossfire in crowded classrooms, confusion between attackers and defenders. What was needed, they said, was not more firepower but prevention. Alongside the gun debate came a reckoning over mental health. The review panel's findings painted a picture of a young man crying for help, flagged repeatedly, but never treated adequately. Privacy laws, well-intentioned, had become barriers. Counselors couldn't share details with professors. Professors couldn't access mental health files. Courts issued orders that no one enforced. For mental health advocates, Virginia Tech exposed a broken system. They pushed for better coordination between schools, courts, and hospitals. They called for investment in counseling services, for stronger early intervention programs, for a culture that took mental illness as seriously as physical illness. But here, too, there was tension. Civil libertarians warned against overreach. They feared that using mental illness as a reason to restrict rights would stigmatize millions of Americans who lived with anxiety, depression, or other conditions without ever posing a threat. Where was the line, they asked, between treatment and surveillance? Between help and punishment? Then there was campus security. Before April 16th, most universities had no mass notification systems. The 2-hour gap at Virginia Tech became the cautionary tale. Without instant alerts, students walked into danger blind. Within months, campuses nationwide scrambled to adopt text alert systems, sirens, and lockdown protocols. But even here, debates erupted. Could universities truly prepare for a lone gunman determined to kill? Could drills and alerts prevent chaos? Or would they simply create false security? As these arguments raged, one fact remained inescapable. The victims' families were still burying their children. Funerals stretched across Virginia, across the United States, across the world. While politicians clashed on Capitol Hill, parents placed photographs on coffins and whispered goodbyes. The Virginia Tech tragedy became a mirror, reflecting the nation's deepest divides. Guns, mental health, liberty, security. Each side saw in the massacre proof of its own position. For those in Blacksburg, however, the noise of national debate often felt distant, even insulting. Their grief was not theoretical. It was not about politics. It was about empty dorm rooms, unplayed instruments, unfinished degrees. Still, as weeks turned into months, the policy arguments grew louder, and Virginia Tech became shorthand in every conversation about violence in America. The massacre was no longer just a tragedy. It was a battleground. When the last shot echoed through Norris Hall and police stormed inside, survival looked like chaos. Students scrambled out of shattered windows, some barefoot, some bleeding, others too dazed to notice the cuts in their skin. Classrooms were left in disarray. Overturned desks, notebooks soaked in blood, cell phones buzzing on the floor with parents' numbers flashing again and again. For those who made it out alive, survival was not an ending. It was the beginning of something they would carry for the rest of their lives. Survivors' guilt set in immediately. In the hours after, students sat in hospitals with bandaged arms and legs, asking why they had lived while the person sitting beside them in class had not. One survivor, shot multiple times, wept not for his pain but because his best friend hadn't made it. Another described lying on the floor, pretending to be dead, listening to the footsteps of the gunman returning, and wondering why the bullets had missed her. For professors, the guilt was no less heavy. Those who had fought to shield students asked themselves whether they could have done more. Those who survived by chance replayed every second, haunted by the faces of students they would never see again. The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical ones. Some survivors could not return to classrooms at all. The sound of a door slamming shut made them flinch. The backfire of a car sent their hearts racing. Even the chirp of a cell phone ringtone, echoing one that had buzzed unanswered in Norris Hall, could trigger waves of panic. Counselors were brought to campus by the dozens. Therapists, grief specialists, clergy. They held sessions in dorm lobbies, in classrooms, in the library. Students packed into group therapy circles, some speaking for the first time about what they had seen, others unable to speak at all. Still, the road was uneven. Some survivors leaned into therapy. Others numbed themselves with alcohol, with denial, with silence. A few transferred to other schools, unable to walk the drill field without seeing ghosts. Others stayed, determined to graduate in honor of those who could not. One of the most visible survivors was Colin Goddard, who had been shot 4 times in Norris Hall. After months of surgeries and recovery, he returned to campus, walking with scars and still carrying bullets in his body. His decision to speak publicly about his experience made him a national figure, not because he sought fame, but because he believed telling the story might prevent another massacre. But not all chose public paths. Many survivors retreated into private grief. Their names rarely appeared in headlines, but their lives bore the weight of that April morning. The nightmares, the panic attacks, the anniversaries that reopened wounds. The families of survivors carried their own burdens. Parents who received the miraculous phone call, "I'm alive," often felt joy quickly tangled with guilt when they met families who had received no such call. One mother said, through tears, "I thank God my daughter lived, and I ask God every day, why not theirs?" Virginia Tech responded with resources, counseling, academic accommodations, a memorial center. Professors adjusted assignments, delayed exams. But no syllabus, no university policy, could erase the trauma of hearing a gunman's footsteps in the hallway. For survivors, life split into 2 timelines, before April 16th and after. The person they had been, carefree, focused on classes, dreaming of summer plans, was gone. In their place stood someone older, heavier, carrying grief and questions with no answers. Yet within that darkness, there were glimmers of resilience. Survivors formed bonds, checking on each other, refusing to let anyone feel alone. They told stories of the friends they had lost, keeping memories alive in late-night conversations, in yearbook dedications, in tattoos inked with names and dates. For some, survival became a mission, to live fully, to honor the 32 by carrying their dreams forward. For others, survival was simply endurance, one day at a time, one breath at a time. And for all of them, survival was complicated. It was joy and sorrow intertwined. It was gratitude laced with guilt. It was carrying both the miracle of living and the nightmare of remembering. April 16th was not the end of their story. It was the scar at the center of it. In the weeks after the shooting, Virginia Tech's campus bore the weight of silence. The drill field, once filled with laughter, frisbees, and rushing footsteps between classes, became a gathering ground for grief. 32 stones were placed there, each carved with a name. Students knelt before them, leaving flowers, handwritten notes, and photographs. Some sat for hours saying nothing, simply keeping vigil. Those stones became sacred. They stood not only for the dead, but for the resilience of the living. Each morning, more offerings appeared. Candles, ribbons, even class rings left by alumni returning to grieve alongside their community. The Hokie spirit, as students called it, took on new meaning. Once a phrase shouted at football games, "Let's go, Hokies!" It now became a cry of unity in sorrow. Across the nation, universities sent banners signed by students, folding them into quilts of support. Emails and letters poured in from strangers, from soldiers overseas, from survivors of other tragedies who knew the pain too well. Classes eventually resumed, though nothing felt normal. Professors struggled to lecture through tears. Students struggled to sit in rooms that looked too much like Norris Hall. Attendance was uneven, assignments often symbolic rather than rigorous. For many, simply showing up was the victory. Graduation that May was unlike any before. Empty chairs were draped in sashes, honoring the students who would never cross the stage. Families accepted diplomas on behalf of their children, tears streaming as the crowd rose in a standing ovation. It was a celebration wrapped in mourning. Joy for those who graduated, grief for those whose names would be forever tied to that spring. Virginia Tech also faced a question larger than academics: how to define itself moving forward. Would it be remembered only as the site of a massacre? Or could it reclaim its identity as a place of learning, innovation, and community? The administration worked carefully. Memorial scholarships were established in the victims' names. Counseling resources were expanded. The university redesigned its emergency alert system, adding sirens, text alerts, and training exercises. Virginia Tech became, paradoxically, one of the safest campuses in the country because it had learned the cost of being unprepared. But identity was harder to rebuild. Students wore, we remember, bracelets, carried ribbons, and marked April 16th with solemn vigils. Every year, the campus paused at the time of the shootings, bells tolling across Blacksburg, the drill field filled with silence, broken only by the reading of names. For new students who arrived in the years after, Virginia Tech was both a thriving university and a place haunted by memory. They walked past Norris Hall, renovated but still standing, and knew its history. They sat in classrooms where professors had once died protecting their students. They studied under banners that read, "We will prevail." Healing was not a single moment. It was 1,000 small ones. A classmate returning to campus after months of therapy. A professor resuming lectures in a hall filled with new faces. A football game where the roar of the crowd carried not only school pride but defiance. We are still here. The tragedy never disappeared from Virginia Tech's identity, but it became something woven into its fabric. Not the whole story, but a thread of resilience, of community bound together by the worst day in its history. For the families, for the survivors, for the Hokies spread around the world, Virginia Tech became a symbol of both loss and endurance. The 32 were gone, but they were remembered, not only on the stones of the drill field, but in every act of kindness, every scholarship given, every flame lit on an April night. The massacre had defined a moment. The healing defined what came after. Before April 16, 2007, few students at American universities gave much thought to campus security. Colleges were places of freedom, of open lawns and unlocked doors. Safety drills were for high schools, not sprawling universities. Virginia Tech changed that forever. In the aftermath of the massacre, university leaders across the country studied the events with alarm. The question wasn't just how had this happened at Virginia Tech? It was, could it happen here? And the answer, most reluctantly realized, was yes. The first change was communication. The 2-hour gap at Virginia Tech had shown that hesitation could be fatal. Before 2007, many universities relied on email to alert students of emergencies. But email was too slow, too easy to miss. Within a year of the tragedy, campuses nationwide invested in mass notification systems. Text alerts, sirens, digital signage that could broadcast warnings instantly. Today, students at nearly every major university have experienced that familiar buzz. Shelter in place. Active shooter reported. Stay inside until further notice. That immediacy was born in the ashes of Virginia Tech. Lockdown protocols also spread. Colleges had once prided themselves on openness. Libraries accessible at all hours, dorms with doors propped open, academic halls free to wander. After 2007, openness was redefined. Card swipe entry systems multiplied. Security cameras sprouted. Drills were introduced, some modeled after K-12 active shooter trainings, adapted for sprawling campuses with tens of thousands of students. Police departments on campuses also changed. At Virginia Tech, officers had responded quickly, but the scale of the attack outpaced their preparedness. Across the nation, universities began arming campus police, training them for tactical response, coordinating more closely with city and state law enforcement. The idea that campus officers were simply traffic wardens or dorm mediators ended. They became first responders in the truest sense. But the ripple effects weren't just about security infrastructure. They also reshaped policy and culture. Universities began establishing threat assessment teams, committees of faculty, administrators, counselors, and police who could share information and intervene if a student showed troubling behavior. Where once privacy laws had kept silos in place, new interpretations encouraged collaboration. If a student's writings raised alarms, if police received complaints, if counselors saw risk, the dots could finally be connected. Virginia Tech also shifted the national psyche of students. Freshmen arriving on campuses in 2008 and beyond did so in a new world. They carried not only laptops and cell phones, but also the knowledge that college was not immune from violence. Orientation programs began to include safety protocols. Run, hide, fight. Phrases once foreign to campuses became part of the lexicon. Yet even as reforms spread, questions lingered. Could any of it truly stop another determined gunman? Would sirens, locks, and drills matter when seconds meant the difference between life and death? Critics argued that universities were simply hardening the shell without addressing the root causes. Untreated mental illness, easy access to firearms. Supporters countered that preparedness could save lives, even if prevention remained elusive. The reality was this: Virginia Tech had forced a reckoning. No longer could universities assume that mass shootings were problems of other places. They were problems of everywhere. And so, from Blacksburg outward, a new era of campus safety began. One written in blood. One that no university would ever again ignore. When the name Seung-Hui Cho flashed across headlines on April 16, 2007, a quiet dry cleaning shop in Centerville, Virginia, was thrust into the storm. Behind the counter, Cho's parents had spent years pressing shirts and mending trousers, living modestly, working long hours, and raising their 2 children. To their customers, they were polite, hardworking, unremarkable. No one could have imagined that their youngest son would become infamous overnight. The news arrived with devastating clarity. Not only was Cho dead, he was the shooter. 32 lives extinguished, dozens wounded, hundreds traumatized, and the responsibility traced back to their family. Neighbors recalled the stunned silence of the Cho household. Curtains drawn, lights dimmed, no one coming or going. FBI agents arrived quickly, combing through belongings, searching for clues. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, cameras aimed at the modest townhouse where the family lived. Strangers who had never spoken to them speculated about their parenting, their culture, their secrets. In the days that followed, Cho's parents issued a statement, a letter handwritten in sorrow and disbelief. They apologized, not defensively but desperately, writing that they felt heartbroken, deeply shamed and lost. They asked forgiveness from the families of the victims, even as they admitted they could never forgive themselves. For them, grief came in 2 layers. They had lost a son, and their son had taken 32 others with him. To mourn him publicly was unthinkable. To disown him felt impossible. They carried the kind of grief with no name, grief tainted by horror and shame. Cho's sister, Seung-Hui Cho, broke her silence in an essay published months later. She described the devastation of learning that her brother, the quiet boy she had grown up with, had become a murderer. "He was our baby," she wrote. "Now he is a monster." She spoke of the shame her family endured, of the endless nights her parents wept. She admitted that at times she wished her brother had never been born. And yet, he had been her brother, a part of her life she could not erase. In South Korea, the response was immediate and painful. The government issued a formal apology to the United States. Newspapers filled with shameful headlines, "Korean Student Massacres 32. Citizens feared a backlash, worried that all Koreans in America would be painted with the brush of Cho's actions. Churches in Seoul held vigils not only for the victims but also for Cho's family, recognizing their unique burden. Back in Virginia, the Cho family lived in near seclusion. They did not attend public memorials. They did not appear at press conferences. To do so would have meant stepping into the gaze of families who had lost children to their sons' bullets. They grieved in private, hiding from a world that saw their surname as synonymous with evil. For scholars of tragedy, Cho's family became a haunting reminder. Violence destroys not only victims but also the families of perpetrators. The Chos had come to America seeking opportunity, believing education would lift their children. Instead, they were left with ashes, their name forever linked to massacre. And yet, even within that shadow, one truth endured. They, too, had lost someone they loved, not to murder, but to the abyss of untreated illness and rage. They had lost their son long before April 16th, though they had not realized it until the world did. Their silence since has been almost complete. No interviews, no documentaries, no public appearances. Just the quiet, lifelong task of carrying shame that can never be shed. In tragedies, victims are mourned and killers condemned. But the families of killers occupy a lonely, unbearable middle ground. For the Cho family, that became their permanent reality. Grieving privately, apologizing endlessly, and living out their days in the long, cold shadow of Virginia Tech. When the gunfire ended at Virginia Tech, the shock was immediate, the grief overwhelming, but the story did not end there. In the years that followed, the massacre became something darker. A blueprint. Criminologists call it the contagion effect, the way mass violence inspires more of the same. The images of Seung-Hui Cho in his black cap and leather jacket, staring into a camera while brandishing weapons, were broadcast around the world. His rambling manifesto was dissected by reporters, debated by commentators, and studied by law enforcement. To the grieving, it was grotesque. To certain disturbed individuals, it was inspiration. In 2008, a year after Virginia Tech, a gunman at Northern Illinois University opened fire in a lecture hall, killing 5 students before taking his own life. Investigators found that he had studied school shootings, including Cho's. In 2009, a man opened fire at an immigration center in Binghamton, New York, killing 13. He, too, referenced feelings of isolation and persecution eerily similar to Cho's. Even in distant countries, the echoes carried. In Norway, 2011, Anders Breivik murdered 77 people, many of them teenagers. In his writings, he mentioned Cho by name, listing him among killers he had studied. Over and over, Cho's face reappeared in the manifestos and obsessions of later shooters. His package to NBC, meant as his grand stage, became a twisted legacy, a playbook that others imitated. Virginia Tech also influenced law enforcement training. The massacre reinforced what Columbine had already revealed. Traditional police protocols, waiting for SWAT, surrounding and securing, cost lives when seconds matter. Departments across America began training officers to move in immediately, even with small teams, to confront active shooters before they could inflict maximum damage. That shift in doctrine is now standard, but it was sharpened in the aftermath of April 16th. The tragedy also haunted school culture. High schools and universities studied Virginia Tech in safety seminars. Drills multiplied. Students were taught to run, hide, fight. Professors locked classroom doors and eyed exits during lectures. The sense of openness on campuses dimmed. For survivors and families, this repetition of horror was unbearable. Each time a new shooting made headlines, Aurora, Sandy Hook, Parkland, Uvalde, Virginia Tech resurfaced. Parents of Hokies stood beside new grieving parents, sharing sorrow that needed no translation. Survivors relived their day through someone else's tragedy, the cycle repeating endlessly. And yet, Virginia Tech remained unique in its scale and its symbolism. Columbine had been the watershed for high schools. Virginia Tech was the watershed for colleges and universities. It reminded the world that no place, not even a serene campus in the Blue Ridge Mountains, was immune. The massacre's shadow stretched even into language. To say Virginia Tech in headlines was to invoke not just a university but an event, a shorthand for catastrophe. It joined Columbine, Oklahoma City, 9/11, as a phrase forever changed in meaning. But within that shadow, families and survivors continued to fight back. Their message was clear: do not remember the killer. Remember the victims. Do not let his face be the symbol. Let theirs be. Still, the copycats came. Still, the echoes continued. And so Virginia Tech lives on, not only in memorial stones and candlelight vigils, but in the haunting knowledge that violence can spread, that tragedy itself can be contagious. Time does not heal all wounds, but it teaches communities how to carry them. At the heart of Virginia Tech's campus, on the wide green expanse of the drill field, 32 Hokie stones sit in a solemn arc. Each one bears the name of a life cut short on April 16, 2007. The stones are simple, carved from the same limestone that gives the university its signature look. But together, they form a monument more powerful than any statue or plaque. They are the presence of absence, 32 markers for 32 stories unfinished. Students pass them every day on their way to class, to football games, to study sessions at the library. Some stop to leave flowers. Some run their fingers across the engraved names. Others walk past quietly, their silence itself a tribute. Every year on the anniversary, the drill field transforms. At dawn, the April 16th Remembrance Run begins. Thousands of Hokies running or walking 3.2 miles. 1/10 of a mile for each life lost. That night, candles blaze across the grass. Each flame a memory. Each glow a vow. Bells toll 32 times. Names are read aloud, one by one, until the silence between them becomes as heavy as the words themselves. Virginia Tech also built a permanent memorial, a semicircle of stone with each victim's name etched into it. Families visit often, leaving tokens of love, photographs, letters, ribbons, even favorite snacks once loved by their children. Tourists, too, come to pay respects, standing quietly, struck by the solemnity of a campus that carries both life and loss. Beyond campus, memorials echo worldwide. Scholarships in the victims' names fund students who carry forward their dreams. High schools dedicate benches and gardens. Families plant trees, build foundations, speak at conferences. Each act says the same thing: they are not forgotten. Inside Norris Hall itself, changes came slowly. For a time, the building stood empty, locked and silent, a reminder too painful to enter. But eventually it was renovated and repurposed, housing engineering research labs. A plaque by the entrance honors those who died there. Students who work inside today know its history. Some say they feel the weight of it. Others say they feel inspired to create something meaningful in a place once marked by destruction. The act of remembrance is not only about honoring the past. It is also about resisting the killer's final wish. Cho had mailed his package to NBC hoping his name would be immortalized. Instead, the Hokies chose a different legacy. Year after year, at memorials, speeches, and vigils, the focus is not on him but on the 32. The dancers, musicians, engineers, dreamers, teachers. Remembrance became resistance, refusing to let the tragedy be defined by the killer. Refusing to let grief silence the joy of who the victims were. Refusing to let April 16th be remembered only for horror. And so, each spring, when the campus blooms with dogwoods and the air warms, Virginia Tech gathers again. The candles are lit. The names are spoken. The silence returns. Not erasing the pain, never that, but carrying it together. April 16th, 2007. Remains a date etched in American memory. For those who were there, it is not history. It is a wound, a scar, a moment that divides life into before and after. For the rest of the world, it stands as a symbol of vulnerability, of loss, but also of resilience. The legacy of Virginia Tech is complicated. It is both tragedy and transformation. On one hand, it revealed the cracks in America's systems. A young man whose mental illness was visible to professors, counselors, and even courts slipped through every safety net. Privacy laws meant to protect him instead isolated him further. Background checks meant to prevent dangerous individuals from purchasing firearms failed because records never reached the system. And when violence began, hesitation and misjudgment delayed warnings that might have saved lives. These failures sparked change. Universities across the nation overhauled their emergency systems. Mass text alerts, lockdown drills, and threat assessment teams became standard. Courts and states began reporting more mental health rulings to federal databases. Law enforcement rewrote active shooter protocols, emphasizing speed and immediate response. And yet, the massacres continued. Northern Illinois, Aurora, Sandy Hook, Charleston, Orlando, Parkland, Uvalde. Each one, in some way, carried the shadow of Virginia Tech. Each one forced survivors and families in Blacksburg to relive their own tragedy, their own unanswered questions. Virginia Tech taught lessons, but America has struggled to learn them fully. Beyond policy, the legacy is human. The 32 lives lost were not erased. They live on in stories told, scholarships funded, memorials built. Survivors carry scars but also resilience, speaking out, supporting others, insisting that their pain not be in vain. Families turned grief into advocacy, changing laws and shaping conversations. Professors like Liviu Librescu are remembered not only for how they died but for the courage they embodied. The Hokie Nation itself became a symbol. "We are Virginia Tech," Nikki Giovanni declared. And those words still echo every April when candles light the drill field. They remind the world that tragedy does not define a community. The response to it does. But the hardest truth remains this: no memorial, no reform, no speech can fill the absence. Parents still walk past empty bedrooms. Siblings still mark birthdays with tears. Survivors still wake in the night, heart pounding, remembering the footsteps in Norris Hall. The legacy of Virginia Tech is not closure. It is endurance. It is a call to remember. Not the face of the killer, not the horror of his acts, but the lives of 32 bright souls who should have had decades more to live, to love, to dream. And it is a challenge to keep asking the questions, to keep pressing for solutions, to refuse the comfort of forgetting. For forgetting would be the truest failure. 16 years later, the stones still stand on the drill field. Students still stop to trace their fingers over names. Every April, bells still toll 32 times. And in those moments, silence speaks louder than any words. Virginia Tech will always carry the weight of April 16th. But it will also carry the light of memory, the reminder that even in the face of unspeakable darkness, communities can stand, mourn, endure, and prevail.